The Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia during the era of its domination by the Soviet Union after World War II. It began on 5 January 1968, when reformist Alexander Dubček was elected first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and continued until 21 August when the Soviet Union and other members of the Warsaw Pact invaded the country to halt the reforms. The Prague Spring reforms were a strong attempt by Dubček to grant additional rights to the citizens of Czechoslovakia in an act of partial decentralization of the economy and democratization. The freedoms granted included a loosening of restrictions on the media, speech and travel. After national discussion of dividing the country into a federation of 3 republics, Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia and Slovakia, Dubček oversaw the decision to split into 2, the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. This was the only formal change that survived the end of Prague Spring, though the relative success of the nonviolent resistance undoubtedly prefigured and facilitated the peaceful transmission to liberal democracy with the collapse of Soviet hegemony in 1989. The reforms, especially the decentralization of administrative authority, were not received well by the Soviets, who, after failed negotiations, sent 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops and tanks to occupy the country. A large wave of emigration swept the nation. A spirit of nonviolent resistance was mounted throughout the country, involving attempted fraternization, painting over and turning street signs, defiance of various curfews, etc. While the Soviet military had predicted that it would take 4 days to subdue the country, the resistance held out for 8 months, and was only circumvented by diplomatic stratagems. There were sporadic acts of violence and several suicides by self-immolation, but there was no military resistance. Czechoslovakia remained controlled until 1989, when the Velvet Revolution ended pro-Soviet rule peacefully, undoubtedly drawing upon the successes of the non-violent resistance 20 years earlier. The resistance also became an iconic example of civilian-based defense, which, along with unarmed civilian peacekeeping, constitute the 2 ways that non-violence can be and occasionally has been applied directly to military or paramilitary threats. After the invasion, Czechoslovakia entered a period of normalization. Subsequent leaders attempted to restore the political and economic values that had prevailed before Dubček gained control of the KSC. Gustav Husák, who replaced Dubček and also became president, reversed almost all of Dubček's reforms. The Prague Spring inspired music and literature such as the work of Václav Havel, Karel Husa, Karel Kryl, and Milan Kundera's novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Background: the process of de-Stalinization in Czechoslovakia had begun under Antonin Novotný in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but had progressed slower than in most other states of the Eastern Bloc. Following the lead of Nikita Khrushchev, Novotný proclaimed the completion of socialism, and the new constitution, accordingly, adopted the name Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. The pace of change, however, was sluggish. The rehabilitation of Stalinist-era victims, such as those convicted in the Slansky trials, may have been considered as early as 1963, but did not take place until 1967. In the early 1960s, Czechoslovakia underwent an economic downturn. The Soviet model of industrialization applied poorly to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was already quite industrialized before World War II, and the Soviet model mainly took into account less developed economies. Novotny's attempt at restructuring the economy, the 1965 New Economic Model, spurred increased demand for political reform as well. 1967 Writers' Congress. As the strict regime eased its rules, the Union of Czechoslovak Writers cautiously began to air discontent. and in the Union's Gazette, Literary Noviny, members suggested that literature should be independent of party doctrine. In June 1967, a small fraction of the Czech Writers' Union sympathized with radical socialists, specifically Ludvík Vakulik, Milan Kundera, Jan Procházka, Antonín Jaroslavliem, Pavel Kohut and Ivan Klima. A few months later, at a party meeting, it was decided that administrative actions against the writers who openly expressed support of Reformation would be taken. Since only a small part of the Union held these beliefs, the remaining members were relied upon to discipline their colleagues. Control over Literary Noviny and several other publishing houses was transferred to the Ministry of Culture, and even members of the party who later became major reformers, including Dubček, endorsed these moves. Dubček's rise to power. As president, Antonín Novotný was losing support. Alexander Dubček, first secretary of the Regional Communist Party of Slovakia, and economist Otto Sik challenged him at a meeting of the Central Committee. Novotný then invited Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev to Prague that December, seeking support, but Brezhnev was surprised at the extent of the opposition to Novotný and thus supported his removal as Czechoslovakia's leader. Dubček replaced Novotný as first secretary on 5 January 1968. On the 22nd of March 1968, Novotný resigned his presidency and was replaced by Ludvík Svoboda, who later gave consent to the reforms. Early signs of change were few. When the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia Presidium member Josef Smrkovský was interviewed in a Rude Pravo article, entitled "What Lies Ahead?", he insisted that Dubček's appointment at the January plenum would further the goals of socialism and maintain the working-class nature of the Communist Party. Literary Listy, however, right after Dubček assumed power, the scholar Eduard Goldstucker became chairman of the Union of Czechoslovak Writers and thus editor-in-chief of the previously hardline communist weekly Literary Noviny, which under Novotný had been filled with party loyalists. Goldstucker tested the boundaries of Dubček's devotion to freedom of the press when he appeared on a television interview as the new head of the Union. On 4 February, in front of the entire nation, he openly criticized Novotný, exposing all of Novotny's previously unreported policies and explaining how they were preventing progress in Czechoslovakia. Despite the official government statement that allowed for freedom of the press, this was the first trial of whether or not Dubček was serious about reforms. Goldstucker suffered no repercussions, and Dubček instead began to build a sense of trust among the media, the government, and the citizens. It was under Goldstucker that the journal's name was changed to Literary Listy, and on 29 February 1968, the Writers' Union published the first copy of the censor-free Literary Listy. By August 1968, Literary Listy had a circulation of 300,000, making it the most published periodical in Europe. Socialism with a Human Face. On the 20th anniversary of Czechoslovakia's victorious February, Dubček delivered a speech explaining the need for change following the triumph of socialism. He emphasized the need to enforce the leading role of the party more effectively, and acknowledged that, despite Clement Gottwald's urgings for better relations with society, the party had too often made heavy-handed rulings on trivial issues. Dubček declared the party's mission was to build an advanced socialist society on sound economic foundations. A socialism that corresponds to the historical democratic traditions of Czechoslovakia. In accordance with the experience of other communist parties, in April, Dubček launched an action program of liberalizations, which included increasing freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement, with economic emphasis on consumer goods and the possibility of a multi-party government. The program was based on the view that socialism cannot mean only liberation of the working people from the domination of exploiting class relations. but must make more provisions for a fuller life of the personality than any bourgeois democracy. It would limit the power of the secret police and provide for the federalization of the CSSR into two equal nations. The program also covered foreign policy, including both the maintenance of good relations with Western countries in cooperation with the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations. It spoke of a 10-year transition through which democratic elections would be made possible and a new form of democratic socialism would replace the status quo. Those who drafted the action program were careful not to criticize the actions of the post-war communist regime, only to point out policies that they felt had outlived their usefulness. For instance, the immediate post-war situation had required centralist and directive administrative methods to fight against the remnants of the bourgeoisie, since the antagonistic classes were said to have been defeated with the achievement of socialism. These methods were no longer necessary. Reform was needed for the Czechoslovak economy to join the scientific technical revolution in the world, rather than relying on Stalinist-era heavy industry, labor power, and raw materials. Furthermore, since internal class conflict had been overcome, workers could now be duly rewarded for their qualifications and technical skills without contravening Marxism-Leninism. The program suggested it was now necessary to ensure important positions were filled by capable, educated socialist expert cadres, in order to compete with capitalism. Although it was stipulated that reform must proceed under KSC direction, popular pressure mounted to implement reforms immediately. Radical elements became more vocal. Anti-Soviet polemics appeared in the press. The Social Democrats began to form a separate party, and new unaffiliated political clubs were created. Party conservatives urged repressive measures, but Dubček counseled moderation and re-emphasized KSC leadership. At the Presidium of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in April, Dubček announced a political program of socialism with a human face. In May, he announced that the 14th Party Congress would convene in an early session on the 9th of September. The Congress would incorporate the action program into the party statutes, draft a federalization law, and elect a new central committee. Dubček's reforms guaranteed freedom of the press, and political commentary was allowed for the first time in mainstream media. At the time of the Prague Spring, Czechoslovak exports were declining in competitiveness, and Dubček's reforms planned to solve these troubles by mixing planned and market economies. Within the party, there were varying opinions on how this should proceed. Certain economists wished for a more mixed economy while others wanted the economy to remain mostly socialist. Dubček continued to stress the importance of economic reform proceeding under Communist Party rule. On the 27th of June, Ludvík Vaculík, a leading author and journalist, published a manifesto titled The 2000 Words. It expressed concern about conservative elements within the KSC and so-called foreign forces. Vaculík called on the people to take the initiative in implementing the reform program. Dubček, the party presidium, the National Front, and the cabinet announced this manifesto. Publications and media. Dubček's relaxation of censorship ushered in a brief period of freedom of speech and the press. The first tangible manifestation of this new policy of openness was the production of the previously hardline communist weekly Literní Noviny, renamed Literní Listy. Freedom of the press also opened the door for the first honest look at Czechoslovakia's past by Czechoslovakia's people. Many of the investigations centered on the country's history under communism, especially in the instance of the Joseph Stalin period. In another television appearance, Goldstucker presented both doctored and undoctored photographs of former communist leaders who had been purged, imprisoned, or executed and thus erased from communist history. The Writers' Union also formed a committee in April 1968, headed by the poet Jaroslav Seifert. to investigate the persecution of writers after the communist takeover in February 1948 and rehabilitate the literary figures into the Union, bookstores and libraries, and the literary world. Discussions on the current state of communism and abstract ideas such as freedom and identity were also becoming more common. Soon, non-party publications began appearing, such as the trade union daily Prachi. This was also helped by the Journalists' Union, which by March 1968 had already convinced the Central Publication Board, the government censor, to allow editors to receive uncensored subscriptions for foreign papers, allowing for a more international dialogue around the news. The press, the radio, and the television also contributed to these discussions by hosting meetings where students and young workers could ask questions of writers such as Goldstucker, Pavel Kohut, and Jan Prochaska, and political victims such as Joseph Smirkovsky, Zdeněk Hevzela, and Gustav Hasek. Television also broadcast meetings between former political prisoners and the communist leaders from the secret police or prisons where they were held. Most importantly, this new freedom of the press and the introduction of television into the lives of everyday Czechoslovak citizens moved the political dialogue from the intellectual to the popular sphere.